Hello everyone, welcome to our Truth Be Told YouTube channel with your hosts Rick Howard and Mike Maney.
Hello, Mike.
Well, hello, Rick.
How are things up in Missoula, Montana?
Cold.
I shouldn't tell on you because we're supposed to keep each other's confidences, but
Here we go.
Before we came on, you told me how happy you were that you woke up to a few inches of snow in your backyard. Can you tell our viewers why you were happy about that?
Yes, most certainly. Now that you brought it up impromptu, that means I don't have to clean up my backyard from the dog. It covered it.
You must have a wife like I do that might have just mentioned it in passing yesterday.
Yes. But expecting you to go out there and clean up all the dog mess.
What to us seems like just an innocent statement. You know, she
Yes.
probably said, I wasn't there, I don't know, but she probably said something just like, hey, that's interesting. There's no snow out in the backyard.
Yes.
And men being such simple, dense creatures.
Yes.
Yeah, that is kind of interesting, isn't it?
Right. Not picking up the clue.
Not knowing there's a comma there, not a period.
Right. Yeah.
And that means it's time to go out and clean up the yard.
Yeah. Wink. You know what I'm talking about. Yes. So yes, the 2 inches of snow saved me from having to do that chore for now.
Yeah, for now. After all, it is the middle of March, so at some point it's going to not snow for several days at a time. Although you can get snow clear to what is it, Memorial Day or something.
It's been crazy.
Anyway, welcome everyone to Truth Be Told. Today is session 71. It's just hard to believe.
It is hard to believe, yes.
And today is March the 15th, 2023. So we should warn our viewers, beware of the Ides of March.
Yes.
So I thought I knew this, but I checked it out this morning just to refresh my memory. The word Ides means middle. So the middle. Actually, the Romans, the middle of every month, they celebrated to the god Jupiter. So that's why Julius Caesar's so-called friends, allies, who were really became his enemies, chose that day because it was kind of like a festival or holy day or something to them. And that's when they chose to murder him. So.
And then the famous line, "Et tu, Brutus?"
Yeah. And if you're in the ministry very long, that phrase comes to your mind, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
There are times in your ministry where those you thought were your ally.
Yes, yeah. Become a Brutus.
Anyway, we're marching along toward 100 sessions eventually, and there's plenty of material ahead of us. So I think we'll get there because we've only gone through Genesis and Exodus, and every time I look back at those two books, I think to myself, we need to go back and redo some sessions because we skipped a lot. But when I say that to myself, it's because I'm looking at it from, we're trying to have kind of a narrow focus of looking for Christ through these scriptures, through these books. So that means we're not going into great detail about some of the subjects that normally we might if we were like teaching through the book or preaching a series of messages. So that is our excuse. If those of you watching these sessions and you're familiar with Genesis and Exodus and you're banging your head against the wall saying, how come they just skipped over that part? That's the part I wanted. It's kind of like commentaries.
Yes.
You go look up kind of a difficult phrase or verse or controversial, and so you go out there to see what others have to say about it. And of course, that's the verse they skip over in their comments because they didn't know what to say about it either.
Well, that's where our invitation for their comments comes out. Please let us know.
Yeah, we don't believe it or not, you viewers who watch these, sometimes well over 100, couple hundred on some of them, views on some of our sessions, and we get very, very few, as in zero, most of the time.
Yes,
comments.
yes.
We might get a few likes,
Uh-huh.
and once in a while we'll get a comment like "good session" or something like that, but very little commentary.
Yes.
Sometimes,
Yeah.
I'm thankful for what we do get on that, but
so we're asking for questions. If you have questions or an area that you want to zero in on, we're definitely open for that. If you just send us the in the way of a comment or an email, hit us up with those questions.
Yes.
More specifically, hit Brother Rick up with those questions.
No, we're getting to the book where you're the expert, Leviticus.
Oh, man. Oh, man.
It's interesting, the timing, because in my daily Bible readings, I read 3 chapters of the Old Testament each day, each days, and a chapter in the New Testament, and then a psalm. So that way I go through pretty much the whole Bible in a year without having to, a lot of the read through the Bible schedules, you have to like mark it every day or look at the chart or something, a little bit of extra work to see where you're supposed to be. My wife is doing an interesting one this year that I've never done. It's reading through the Bible in chronological order. And so, she read the first 11 chapters of Genesis, and then it took her over to Job. And then, so it's kind of like that. So she'll read through Ezra and Nehemiah much later than what they're in our Bibles.
Okay. Like okay. Yeah.
That's a good way to do it. Kind of keeps you in a time order. But it just so happens that today, my 3 chapters in the Old Testament was Leviticus chapters 1 through 3. So,
well, there you go.
For the next couple of weeks, I'll be reading 3 chapters a day in Leviticus.
Nice.
So it's kind of interesting, the timing, because I didn't plan it that way. But we're going to have a few sessions in the book of Leviticus. And I noticed something this morning as I was reading. I blamed it on, I usually do my daily reading as soon as I get up, say my prayers, and then do my Bible reading. Because if I'm not careful, I wake up a lot of times an hour or so before I get up and be thinking about the day and what I need to do and all that. And a lot of times my mind starts thinking about the sermon for Sunday or the lesson for Wednesday night or something, or some special event coming up that I need to prepare a message. And so that captures my thinking, and I'm kind of developing it, laying there in bed. Some good thoughts come to my mind. If I'm not careful, I'll jump right into that and neglect my prayers and Bible readings, because that's the main thing on my mind when I get up.
Oh, I tell you, I totally understand. I struggle with that because
most pastors are that way.
Yes, I struggle with that.
We have a sermon pressing down on us, or a lesson tomorrow night, pressing down on me, and it's going to take several hours of research and preparation and outlining and all that. And so you think, well, okay, I'll just later today I'll get to my Bible reading, but then ox fall in the ditch and you got to go get them out, and before you know it, the day is done.
Yeah.
So anyway, it just by coincidence that I started Leviticus this morning, and back to my thought, I blamed it on still being half asleep. I read through the first couple of chapters and I thought to myself, do I remember what I just read? You've done that in Bible reading, haven't you?
Oh, yeah.
Because if I'm not careful, my mind starts drifting to what I want to study, what I really want to get to.
Yes.
And so Leviticus really lends itself to letting your mind drift. Because like these first 3 chapters this morning, okay, it's the burnt offering and the sin offering and the peace offering and the meal offering, and and this animal and that animal, and cut it up this way, and if it's that animal, do it this way. And so you're reading through all the details of it, and it's easy to let your mind drift. And that's why Leviticus is one of the least favorite books of the Bible for most people, because it goes into great detail about the sacrifices, about the priesthood, about other laws. And, you know, a lot of people, especially many groups, don't see the importance of the Old Testament. And so they're thinking, boy, that's not even for me. Why even focus on it? I'm in the New Testament church, you know, and those things are gone. But there are principles laid down in these laws that carry over to us today. And many of these laws began before the law of Moses, such as these sacrifices. You know, the first chapter of Job, he offered burnt sacrifices for each of his children every day. Well, if he did in fact live before Abraham or during the time of Abraham, or, you know, sometime it was well before Mount Sinai and the law of Moses. And he was not even of the Jewish bloodline as we think later. And yet he knew all about offering proper sacrifices, killing an animal and offering on an altar for his family. And so it was real common. Of course, Abel's good sacrifice, he killed the best of his flock and offered it as a blood sacrifice. So they knew right from the beginning. So these things became incorporated into the law of Moses, but they did not in all cases start with the law of Moses. And then many of the things in the law of Moses continue after the cross. And so, you know, it's a misnomer, or it's a wrong statement to think or to say that all those things of the law of Moses are gone.
Right.
So some of them are gone, some of them continue. And so it's, you know, just a blanket statement of saying the law was done away with. Well, you know, if you're not careful, someone will throw it back at you pretty strong, you know, about, oh, okay, it's okay to murder then, you know. So
right. Yeah.
You have to be careful how you say it. But these sacrifices in these first several chapters of Leviticus are really important to study, because it takes all of them, and these 5 that are mentioned in these opening chapters are what we might call ongoing regular sacrifices for the people of the nation to observe and practice. But they are not the totality of all the sacrifices. There were many other sacrifices besides these 5, such as the daily morning and evening sacrifice, such as, you know, the special holy days, Passover and Day of Atonement. All those had special sacrifices. The red heifer offering is not mentioned here. And other sacrifices. I mean, you take like when Solomon dedicated the temple, all the thousands and thousands of animals that were sacrificed at that. So you put them all together, and you wonder why some people like shrink away from God's laws in the Old Testament, because it's such a bloody, it really was a bloody religion, wasn't it? But of course, it takes all of them together to give a complete picture of the sacrifice of Christ.
Yes.
Each one of them offers a particular view of Christ's sacrifice. But it takes all of them and more. And then the amount of them, not just of the types of sacrifices, but the amount of animals killed on a regular basis, in some way is to show the depth and degree of sin, and the depth and the degree of the sacrifice of Christ that it took to take care of the sin problem. So it was kind of God's way of graphically showing what is kind of like the theme of the whole book. And I might read, before we get back to the first few chapters, we might just look at a few verses later. Some of the major themes of the book of Leviticus would be like chapter 10 and verse 3. Moses said to Aaron, "This is what the Lord spoke, saying, by those who come near me, I must be regarded as holy, and before all the people, I must be glorified." So Aaron held his peace. So that kind of describes the whole theme of the book, but it also describes the theme of the whole Bible, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
God is explaining in all the details of these many different laws and sacrifices and responsibilities of the priesthood and all that, is this principle, is how can an unholy people serve and even approach a holy God and not be killed,
Yeah.
and do it in such a way that it says, I must be glorified. So he set it up in a way that not only allows them to approach him without being killed, but with the ability to glorify him in the process. And then there are other verses such as, let me see, 11:44 kind of says somewhat the same thing. For I am the Lord your God, you shall therefore consecrate yourselves, and you shall be holy, for I am holy. Of course, we know that the word holy does not mean sinless, but it means set apart, separated
Yes.
from the nations around them and separated unto God. So now when we say God is holy, we also include the idea of perfection, without sin, completely holy in every sense. But when we talk about us being holy, then we start talking about the need for the blood of Christ to cover us, to forgive us, to cleanse us, and ongoing confession. And then we get into justification, sanctification, because being holy in the New Testament carries the idea also from the same root, Greek word, as to be a saint or to be sanctified, to be set apart. So it's kind of what God is trying to get across here. And so we look at the extreme details of so many of these sacrifices and laws, and we think, why does he dot every I and cross every T? Why does he get into the minutia of the jots and tittles of everything? Every little thing they did, they had to think about, is there a law to cover that?
Yes.
And so, but God was letting them know, I want you to be different than the nations around you. And I want you to be different in every detail, every single part of your life. I want you to be different, set apart unto your God. So I think that's the purpose for a lot of it. Let me see, there's a few other verses I wanted to look at before we get started.
While you're looking for those, Brother Rick, I just mentioned years ago I put together this PowerPoint on that very subject of holiness. And it really had three tiers to it. One was the holiness of the Father in the Old Testament, and then the holiness of Jesus, who really was the image of the invisible God. So he had, of course, had to express that same level of holiness. And then, of course, the commandment, be you holy, for I'm holy, then it trickles on down to us and our responsibility to be holy and to reflect his holiness. So, I've taught that maybe a couple times here over the years. Called Kadosh.
You may have to share that with me, Mike.
All right.
I do have a folder dedicated to the material you send me, and I noticed recently not much has been added for a while.
Cobwebs.
And I know you've still been putting together material.
Oh.
In 1711, it gives us God's solution to the problem of how can an unholy people be holy
Mm-hmm.
and approach a holy God. It involves the shedding of innocent blood.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea taken from Genesis 3:21, when God covered them with the blood of, with the skins of a innocent animal that he had killed.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why Abel realized that it needs to be innocent blood, and all the way through. Now, of course, in one of these offerings, it's called the old King James calls it, it's kind of funny or humorous in a way, it's called the meat offering, but it's the only offering that's not meat.
Right.
So
It's
really
grain.
grain or meal.
Yeah.
But back in the days of King James, when you invited someone over for a meal, you didn't say, I want to have you over for a meal. You say, I want to have you over for meat. So they just used meat for the entirety of the food.
And then serve you oatmeal.
So 1711, for the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls, for it is the blood that makes atonement for the soul. So, we say, well, Leviticus is kind of boring. It's all these laws. It's not even for me. I just skip over it. Well, you look at a verse like 17:11, and how we've been talking about recurring or reoccurring themes in the Bible. How much of the New Testament is based on this principle?
Yes, absolutely.
Going to Romans,
Yeah.
especially Hebrews,
Mm-hmm.
the idea of without the shedding of blood, Hebrews 9:22, 21 and 22. Without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sins.
Mm-hmm.
And
Well, like
so,
you said earlier, these are principles that are picked up on and dealt with further in the New Testament. So they're just basic principles, like you said.
and then like in 20 and 26, and you shall be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy, and have separated you from the peoples, that you should be mine. So the purpose of them being holy through obedience to God and keeping these sacrificial laws and the other laws, and of course they turned it into the more laws you kept, the closer you were to perfection.
Mm-hmm.
And so so then it set up a system where they would compare themselves with each other. I'm more holy than you are.
Yeah.
And not accepting the fact that God gave so many laws and so many details to at least partly teach them it's impossible to keep them completely.
Mm-hmm.
And I need the grace and mercy and forgiveness of God
Yes.
all the way through. And they kind of left off that part. So he talks about atonement. And of course, that involves also the idea of the mercy seat within the Holy of Holies. And the mercy seat is the place of atonement on the Day of Atonement. In the New Testament, we call it propitiation, the covering, the atonement. And those are just really, really important principles. And even like Peter in First Peter, where is that? Chapter 1, I think it is. Maybe I have it written. I should have it all memorized. Yeah, First Peter 1:15 and 16. He quotes this: "Be ye holy, for I am holy."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, and he talks a lot about sanctification. Paul does too. So, the book of Leviticus, maybe as much as any other book of the Torah, lays down principles that are carried over into the New Testament, because Christ is the fulfillment of so much of what's in Leviticus.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really is important, and you really can't even understand the New Testament properly, especially like the book of Hebrews, unless you first understand the general layout of the book of Leviticus, what he's trying to get across to them.
You mentioned a little bit ago about Israel's attitude of, well, the more laws I keep, the holier I am. That sparked a memory of a verse. I thought, well, there's a verse that really says that. It's in Isaiah 65:5. where that was their attitude. Holier than thou. We use the expression holier than thou.
Mm-hmm.
That's where they get that from in Isaiah 65:5.
Yeah, I mean, it's and Paul taught this to the Corinthians. If you compare yourselves among yourselves, you're not wise.
You're not wise. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not a wise thing, but it's just our human nature. You know, I see this a lot in people with addictions. They'll say, well, I may be addicted to that drug, but at least I'm not addicted to the, and they'll name a worse one.
Yes,
so
yes.
it's a way to lessen your
Yes.
addiction or your sin.
Yeah.
And we're not supposed to do that. We're supposed to
Mhm.
freely admit that I fall short often. I
Yes.
need
Yes.
the mercy and grace of God. So this, we call it Leviticus because it has so much to do with the tribe of Levi and the responsibilities of the priests and the sacrifices and all that they're involved in. But the Hebrew name for this book, W-A-Y or V-A-Y, either way, Y-I-Q-R-A, however you want to pronounce that, Vayikra, probably pronouncing it terribly, but it's actually the first in our Bibles, or my New King James, it's the first 4 words in the first verse. But actually the Hebrew word means, and he called. But in my Bible, it says, now the Lord called to Moses. So in Hebrew, the idea is that the Lord's calling out to Moses, giving him the laws for Moses then to share with the people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's what the book of Leviticus is about. But since we're on a mission to try to look for Christ everywhere, and of course, all these sacrifices speak about him, but they're in that first verse, first 2 verses. If we make the Lord the Father and us Moses, and the tabernacle being Christ, because John 1:14, he became flesh and dwelt, which is the word for tabernacle. He tabernacled among us. So the Father speaks to us from the tabernacle, from the human tabernacle, from Christ. So God speaks to us today through his holy tabernacle, his Son. And then we are to speak to the children of Israel, to others. So this idea of the message, as Jesus often said in the Gospel of John, I'm not speaking on my own behalf. I only speak what the Father tells me to. And I'm speaking it to individuals for them to go out and share with other people. So that very idea is laid down in the first 2 verses. It's we would almost call this a gospel passage, because the principle of the Father speaking to us through the Son and us sharing it with others in verse 2. And what is the message we are to share? When any of you brings an offering to the Lord, well, that offering is to be our hearts. That offering is to be our soul, our spirit, our lives, our bodies, everything about us that begins in a moment we call salvation, extends throughout the rest of our life, a living sacrifice, Romans 12:1 and 2. So the message we are to share with others is how to bring an offering, a sacrifice to the Lord that he will accept, and that will bring glory to him. And so that is to be, as the passage says, my son, give me your heart. That's what the Lord is looking for. And so how often throughout the rest of the Old Testament, passages like, I'll get to these sacrifices eventually, but I'm trying to just lay a groundwork for this session and further sessions. A passage like Micah chapter 6, let me find that real quick. Micah chapter 6 and verse 7 and 8. These kind of things are said often in the prophets. Micah 6, 7, and 8. Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has shown you, O man, what is good. What does the Lord require of you but to do justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with your God?
Mm-hmm.
So even though God demanded, expected, required all these sacrifices in every small detail of them, it was not the sacrifice itself just being done in obedience in an outward sense,
Mm-hmm.
that God was pleased with.
Mm-hmm.
God wanted them to understand the deeper significance that
Yes.
these offerings are to truly be a sacrifice. They cost you something.
Mm-hmm.
They cost you your pride,
Mm-hmm.
cost you your stubbornness, your
Mm-hmm.
wanting to do your own thing, your own way. You have to give that up. And the sacrifice represents it, because on so many of them, when they brought it to the tabernacle and temple, they were to place their hands on its head as a symbol of, I'm identifying with this animal, because even though I'm killing an animal, I'm really picturing I'm killing my flesh, my own flesh,
Mm-hmm.
killing my own nature.
Mm-hmm.
I'm surrendering myself completely. I'm giving this animal up totally to God, but I'm really picturing I'm giving myself totally up to God. And that's the connection, that's the part they began to leave off
Mm-hmm.
quite early, maybe right from the start.
Mm-hmm.
This idea of I'm transferring myself to that animal, and I'm expressing a desire to devote myself totally to the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And that can only come about by humble faith, by sincere love, by extending mercy to others, by walking in a holy manner by God's grace. And they ended up, for instance, in the last book of the Old Testament, Malachi. I've always liked what this said when he says in Malachi 1, 6 through 8, he says, a son honors his father and a servant his master. If then I am the father, where is my honor? And if I am a master, where is my reverence, says the Lord of hosts? To you priests who despise my name. Yet you say, in what way have we despised your name? And here's his answer. You offer defiled food on my altar, but you say, in what way have we defiled you? By saying the table of the Lord is contemptible. And when you offer the blind as a sacrifice, is it not evil? And when you offer the lame and the sick, is it not evil? And of course, they were trying to excuse themselves. It became such a ritual that the idea of bringing the best, bringing something that truly is a sacrifice that costs me something, was being lost. They had let go of that, so they just were going through the ritual practice of offering the animals without. In essence, it's the same idea as practicing physical circumcision, but not circumcision of the heart.
Mm-hmm.
Is what they were doing with the animals.
Mm-hmm.
So God's answer to them, okay, if you think I should accept what you bring to me as an animal sacrifice, offer it to your governor.
Mm-hmm.
Would he be pleased with you? Would he accept you favorably, says the Lord of hosts? Invite somebody important over to your house and feed them the same kind of animal you're offering to me as a sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they wouldn't even think about it, would they?
Right.
They'd be ashamed of themselves. They'd be embarrassed. They'd have to ask for forgiveness. But they had reached a point where they thought God should accept it.
Mm-hmm.
And so the details are given partly to show God is stressing the importance of total obedience, but obedience from the heart, not just as a ritual. One way to look at the book of Leviticus is, they're at Mount Sinai. Moses is up on the mountain a number of times, receiving all these laws. Although it does say in verse 1, the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tabernacle. But let me see, I have the verses here. If you saw the scribbling of my notes, you understand why I'm having a hard time finding the verses. Well, I know the final verse of this book, and it says it a few times all the way through, but I do know the last verse, Leviticus 27:34. These are the commandments which the Lord commanded Moses for the children of Israel on Mount Sinai. So several verses say he received these laws on Mount Sinai, but the first verse says it's from the tabernacle, because I think the idea of harmonizing the two things is that he's transitioning them over because he's getting ready to tell them to leave Mount Sinai, continue on their journey. So he's in the process of transitioning from Mount Sinai to the tabernacle. At the end of Exodus, it speaks about the glory of God came down on the tabernacle and the Holy of Holies. So from at a certain point onward, God will be speaking from the tabernacle to Moses. But really the same things that he talked to Moses about on Mount Sinai. But it's the idea of the tabernacle, I think, means that it's an ongoing message.
Mm-hmm.
The truth of it continues, that it was not just a one-time thing at Mount Sinai, but it needs to be, as Deuteronomy spells out very clearly, teach it to your kids when they get up, when they go to bed, when they eat,
Yes.
all the time.
Yeah.
Put it over the doorposts of your house. So don't just give it to them one time. Talk about it all the time, every day.
I call that salting it in.
Salting it in.
Yeah.
Well, since you mentioned salt, I wasn't going to get to it yet, but let me just ask you a question from chapter 2 in verse 13. Every offering of your grain offering you shall season with salt. You shall not allow the salt of the covenant of your God to be lacking from your grain offering. With all your offerings you shall offer salt. So why do you suppose God wanted salt on all the offerings? And then if you want to make it even a little bit more interesting, verse 11, no grain offering which you bring to the Lord shall be made with leaven, for you shall burn no leaven nor any honey. So honey is prohibited, but salt is required. I like a little bit of salt in things. It brings out the flavor. My wife automatically salts everything even before she tastes it. And so a lot of times I'll taste it first and I'll say, you may want to taste this before you add salt. It's already salty enough. But salt. So why salt but not honey? Because honey is natural and it's tasty, and it adds, especially like these grain offerings, these unleavened bread, a little bit of honey would make it more tasty.
Well, we have salted caramel.
So have you thought much about that? Why salt? Why it was required?
Well, actually, I had a whole message on the salt of the covenant years ago, but you've caught me flat-footed. Let me note that you said that you're getting cobwebs on my folder, so let me send that one to you. But
fortunately, since I knew I'd be asking this question, I didn't want to ask it without having some sort of answer.
Yeah, I knew you would. Yes.
Of course, that passage in 2 Chronicles 13:5, the covenant God made with David, he called it, I've made a covenant of salt with you. So salt seemed to be often used when people made covenants as well. Because salt, of course, you are the salt of the earth. Jesus said to the church, salt is a preservative. So it speaks about purity, pure salt. In that day, salt or any spice, today spices are cheap, but in that day, all the spices, including salt, were expensive. So it speaks about you're adding cost to each sacrifice, adds to the idea of sacrifice. But the covenant of salt was usually the idea of friendship, mutual respect and honor and devotion to each other. So by God accepting their salted sacrifices, he was saying, in their understanding of that time of the covenant of salt being friendship, the idea that I'm wanting a close relationship with you. I'm wanting intimacy with you. I'm wanting it to be one of love and devotion to each other. And Numbers 18:19 is another place he mentions salt. Let me just read that real quick. Numbers 18 and 19. All the heave offerings of the holy things which the children of Israel offer to the Lord, I have given to you and your sons and daughters with you as an ordinance forever. It is a covenant of salt forever before the Lord with you and your descendants with you. So salt being a preservative, here is carrying with it the idea of it endures, it remains preserved. I don't want it broken. I don't want it to stop. I want it to continue, just like salt preserves meat. And of course, the priests were allowed to eat some of the meat being sacrificed. So naturally, meat is much more tasty with salt on it.
Oh, yeah.
But it might also be thinking about the idea of just simple enjoyment, pleasure of eating the sacrifice, the meat of it, and then translating that into, I want your relationship with me to be pleasurable and enjoyable. It's not just about obligation, keeping laws, making sure you don't break one of the commandments. It should be an enjoyable experience that brings delight into your life, just like salted meat does.
Yes.
Instead of unsalted meat.
Yes.
So I think there's a lot can be drawn from that. But at the same time, the idea of no honey then is the other side of the coin, that eventually the sacrifice of Christ is it brings sweetness to us, but it was, and for the joy set before him, he endured the cross. I understand all that, but the physical experience of his sacrifice was more like salt in the wounds than it was like tasting honey. And so it brings about what honey represents, sweetness to our souls, but the actual experience of that animal being killed and bled out, and roasted with fire, speaks more about the qualities of salt than it does of honey. Even though the end result of it, if it's done properly from the heart, is to be somewhat like honey as far as sweetness of the relationship with God.
I'm wondering too, this thought just occurred to me, it may have nothing to do with it, but salt, of course, is formed, naturally. And some period of our history, it had value where people were actually using it as to trade money. Yes.
Yeah.
But on honey, it's made, there's effort on the part of the bees. And so there's work involved. It's not just a natural process. So I don't know if he didn't want that represented.
I think so. I think there's a good point to be made on that.
No iron tool was to be used, in fashioning the furniture, as I recall. Unless am I mixing that up with another verse or another?
No.
So I don't know if that has anything to do with it or not, but I'm thinking, well, it's the work of a byproduct of being busier than a bee, I also had in my notes, I opened up that file real quickly. I'll send it to you. That salt's melting temperature is where was it? 400 degrees, I think it was. No, 1400. Melting point is almost 1400 degrees Fahrenheit. And then I have here, when it does finally melt, it passes quickly, vaporizing into a gas. In other words, it can withstand a lot of heat before it breaks down. So in terms of covenant, God's people would, of course, have to withstand a lot of pressure, a lot of heat from the nations, because they were the covenanted people. Of course, nations were, jealous over that. And so I don't know if that has any bearing on it, but as the salt of the earth, we're going to have to withstand a lot of pressure. If they hated you, they hated me first. And so just as a property of salt is a very high melting point.
Whereas honey is a very low melting point.
Yeah.
And can scorch and burn.
Yeah.
So, anything connected with fire, you have to be really careful if there's honey involved, or it'll scorch and it'll taste terrible and all that. So yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Sacrifices are connected with high heat, and salt can withstand it and honey can't.
Yeah. I know the honey in my cupboard is already, what do they call that, to become granular?
Crystallizes.
Yes, it's crystallizing.
Ours does all the time. We enjoy honey once in a while, but we don't eat it often enough. And at some point, it crystallizes. For a while, it's not quite there, so you turn it upside down and squeeze real hard.
Yes, yeah.
And then after a while, if it's the right kind of lid, you have to take the lid off and use a spoon.
You got to scoop it out. Yeah.
Maybe after a while, you just throw it away.
Go get another one.
Every time we do that, I think to myself, we should buy a smaller container of it next time. So we don't throw part of it away.
Yeah.
But what God is doing in Leviticus, if we think about it, because that just about a year at Mount Sinai, all the laws that is given is organizing them into a nation to function as a nation in their land. So, we say, boy, all these laws and all these details, and they say there's 613 laws in the law of Moses. People say, how could they live like that, all those laws? I've told people in the past, have you ever gone to a lawyer or gone to a court and asked them to let you look in the law book of the laws of the state and of the country? It's like 10 volumes or whatever it is, really thick books. A law about, we have way more laws in our books than what Israel had. So if you look at it that way, and yet we say we live in a free country, we have a lot of freedom, but we have a whole lot more laws. So we tend to think, boy, their life was so restricted. Had a law about everything. But if you think about the amount of laws that we have, we say we're a country not ruled by men, but by laws. I wish it were so, but that's what we say anyway. And so we have just tons of laws in our books. Back when we used to get the daily newspaper, I haven't done that for years. But every year, about the last week of December, there'd be articles about new laws that are coming into effect after the first of the year. You need to be aware of them because some of them could cost you money, or they could throw you in jail or whatever. So, we'd always read through every one of those laws to make sure we don't break them. I hope the quality of my voice up to this point has not been hindered. I had my microphone part of was in the top of my shirt, which is how I wear a lot.
Oh no, you were coming through just fine.
You recorded, okay.
Yeah,
that's good. So, but what God is doing with them at Mount Sinai by giving all these instructions, because Torah, we think of Torah as laws. the Torah really means instructions.
Mm-hmm.
And God wanted them to see these laws as instructions of how to live a godly, productive life as a witness to the nations around them. These are instructions. And that's a much more positive way to look at the law than just a set of obligations and duties, responsibilities.
Well, just the two words. I mean, just when you hear the two words, when they reach your ears, one is more inviting and warm, and the other is cold, and that's why we rebel. Law. We just naturally repel from that word law.
Our flesh nature draws back from that.
Yes, it does. But instruction, that draws you
It's
in.
for my good.
Yeah.
It's helpful. I want instructions.
Yeah.
I need instructions.
Yeah.
So, it's just funny how we look at this part of the Bible in such a negative sense when God was intending it for their good. And when we get toward the end of Leviticus, in a few sessions from now, probably, he's going to talk about the blessings and the curses.
Mm-hmm.
And, as he said several times, the blessings will give you life. The curses will bring you destruction.
Mm-hmm.
But he said, I want you to choose life.
Mm-hmm.
I want you to choose blessing.
Yeah.
Not curses.
Oh, you mean it's a choice. It's not predetermined.
Oh, well.
Interesting.
Let's jump on that. I was going to bring that up in just a minute.
Okay.
But before I do, we'll read through the first few verses of the first chapter. This is their king, God. This is their king setting up his theocracy. It's a theocratic form of government.
Mm-hmm.
And part of carrying out a theocracy of a marriage between religion and secular life, which when God gives it is perfect. That's what the government of the millennial will be, because he will be a benevolent, righteous king, not an evil dictator. But when man attempts a theocracy, it's terrible, as we've seen all through history, that when religion and secular life are married together, it brings about persecution and death, all sorts of terrible things. But in a theocracy, the role of priest is very prominent in their daily life. And so part of the purpose of this book is the king setting up a theocracy, highlighting the role of priests and sacrifices. So if you look at it that way, it's just a more positive light shining upon this book, to where it's not intended to be just a boring set of rules. It's intended to be a pathway of life, of fellowship with God, of close relationship with them, of witness to others. And it's just interesting how we paint some of these Old Testament books with such a negative brush when God intended them to be painted with a positive brush. And it's just our own prejudice, our own failing. So the first 3 or 4 verses of this: Now the Lord called to Moses, spoke to him from the tabernacle of meeting, saying, Speak to the children of Israel and say to them. Of course, he's writing as well. They are to write, they are to memorize, they are to speak. So part of the purpose of the law, which I find fascinating, you get into Deuteronomy 4, Deuteronomy 6, all those verses about to the fathers, when they wake up, when they go to sleep, when they eat, and all that. Talk to them about the things of God. Is teaching them to be an educated people. He instructed them to read, so they had to learn to read. He instructed them to write it, so they had to learn to write. They had to learn to memorize. They had to learn to share it with others. All of that is part of what being an educated, civilized society is like.
Mm-hmm.
And so they had such an advantage over the nations around them who, for most of history, people couldn't read or write much.
Mm-hmm.
And in our own country, until really in the last century, a large portion of people couldn't read or write. So it's just interesting how God incorporated as one of the purposes of giving the law in written form and oral form is to, in the process of them carrying out the will of God for them as a nation, he was also forming a highly educated people.
Could we say, God's way of infusing the ancient liberal arts into the theocracy?
Well, I mean, even in the early parts of our country, Harvard and Yale and all those great universities were started as religious institutions, and they would, even parents in their homes would use the Bible as the main book they would read to their children.
Yes.
And so to teach them how to read and write, they would use the Bible. And so in learning to read and write, they were learning the Bible.
Yes.
Which made them more aware of God, and at some point in their life forming a close relationship with him. So we don't have that today. The Bible's outlawed in schools and every secular institution, so that we are teaching our children basically there is no God, or God has no place in our daily life. So that's terrible. So, okay, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when any one of you brings an offering to the Lord, you shall bring your offering of the livestock, of the herd of the flock. If his offering is a burnt sacrifice of the herd, let him offer a male without blemish. His own free will is quite interesting. God was letting them know right away, I don't want this to be just about obligation. I don't want this to be just about being able to say you kept that law. I want it to be the desire of your heart. I want it to be from a willing mind. I want it to be free will in the sense that you don't consider it just a burden, but you consider it a pleasure because you understand God has provided me a way to have sweet fellowship with him, a relationship with him, have my sins forgiven, live in a holy, cleansed state like he wants me to. These are the means to that end, and to see it in a much more positive light than, oh no, I gotta take my best animal. That sure would have tasted good on the dinner table, or sure would have provided me lots of good wool to make clothes for my kids. Instead of seeing it as only what you're giving up, seeing it as a privilege to offer the best that I have to the God who loves me, takes care of me, blesses me, protects me, and everything. So just a better way of looking at this. He shall offer it of his own free will. At the door of the tabernacle of meeting before the Lord. Then he shall put his hand on the head of the burnt offering. It will be accepted on his behalf to make atonement for him, a covering. So there's a lot to be said about these animal sacrifices. That's not our purpose, other than to reemphasize they speak about an aspect of Christ that's important, that the blood of Christ, as shown in all these sacrifices, is not only about forgiveness. It's about relationship. It's about having peace with God. It's about rejoicing in his love for us, that he allows all of this. And we are to do all of it with a free will, with a good desire. So I'll just kind of close for now, because I think you have a graphic document that you're going to share with us that kind of details these offerings in these first opening chapters. But maybe just we'll get into this maybe more next session. One purpose of the law covenant was to create this, we might call it tension Tension is a good word in the Bible. It's not maybe in the Bible, but it's a good idea the Bible presents. That they were already under the Abrahamic covenant. That's the foundational covenant. Mm-hmm. Paul talks about the law was added and the law was taken away. It was more of a temporary thing, even though a lot of it continues on. But as a whole system of government operation, as a nation in a particular geographic land area, was the law covenant. And so they had the Abrahamic covenant that spoke about promises and blessings, a land and a seed and a blessing to the nations, the Gentiles, and just all of these wonderful things. But then you incorporate the law into it, and it creates this tension of, okay, he's given us this land, but if we don't obey him, he's going to take the land away from us. But we can't keep it perfectly. So how do we keep the land? And so this tension back and forth between the Abrahamic covenant and the law covenant was intended to drive them deeper into their understanding what God was trying to do for them, mature them, help them to grow up, and not just see it as a bunch of laws to keep, but as a way of drawing close to God and receiving the blessings, the promises of the Abrahamic covenant. Maybe another way simply to explain this is how did God resolve this tension between the Abrahamic covenant and the law covenant so that they could receive those promises and blessings of the Abrahamic covenant? And the solution is what we now call the new covenant. And the new covenant is the way to receive what the Abrahamic covenant was all about, in spite of the seeming impossibility of it by not being able to keep the law covenant. The new covenant resolves that conflict. So we'll develop that idea a little bit more, but I just wanted to kind of throw it in so our viewers would have that in their minds when we develop it a little bit more. Or maybe a different way, or maybe a simpler way in some ways to explain this tension that I'm talking about, is that God wanted them to experience as a nation corporately what Paul described in Romans 7, that conflict between the flesh nature and the spirit nature. I want to please God, but my flesh, those things that I should do, I don't. Those things I shouldn't do, I do. And that battle back and forth, the law introduced to them the Romans 7 principle as a nation, so that they would recognize this Abrahamic covenant part of, I have a desire to please God, to serve him, to have a relationship with him. But the law sets things up to where it seems like every time I turn around, I'm breaking one of the laws. So this constant conflict in our human nature as children of God. So I kind of describe the law, because the opening part of Romans 7 explains the purpose of the law, to bring us to Christ. Christ is the end of the law. And we're to be married to him because of his death. And then he goes on to explain that conflict that we have. God was designing things here in the law of Moses to cause them to experience exactly what Paul was talking about in Romans 7. And he ends that chapter by, explaining, in fact, just maybe read a verse or two real quick. What he was trying to set up in them as a nation. He said, verse 21, I find in a law that evil is present with me, the one who wills to do good, for I delight in the law of God according to the inward man. So that's what God wanted them to experience. But he also wanted them to experience that they'd recognize what God was doing for them, for their benefit. But because they're human nature, I see another law in my members, warring against the law of my mind, bringing me into captivity to the law of sin which is in my members. Oh, wretched man that I am. Now, isn't that one purpose of the law of Moses?
Mm-hmm.
It's for every citizen growing up as Jewish Israel, as an Israelite, to reach a place trying to keep the law, but to conclude, oh, wretched man that I am. I need the help of God. I need the mercy, forgiveness of God. Who will deliver me from this body of death? I thank God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then, with the mind, I myself serve the law of God, but with the flesh, the law of sin. There's that conflict, that tension.
Mm-hmm.
We all feel it.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted them to feel it, and he wanted them to reach the same conclusion as we are to reach. In my own wisdom and strength, I cannot.
Mm-hmm.
But in trusting in the grace and mercy and forgiveness of God, he covers my sins and gives me the desire to continue on trying to serve him. So anyway, we'll develop this further as we go along. Do you have any thoughts before you bring up that chart of the sacrifices?
No, I'm ready to jump right in if you're ready.
Okay.
So yeah, if any of our viewers want this chart, just leave a comment or email me, and definitely will send this to you.
And some of you may have studied these offerings or taught lessons on them in more detail than what we brought up today. We really didn't go through each offering much,
Mm-hmm.
just kind of looked at them as a whole, their application to Christ.
Mm-hmm.
But if others of you watching or listening to this have information you'd like to share with us, or even if you'd like to come on with us in person and bring out more about these offerings, we would welcome that. Just let us know, volunteer your time. We'll set it up. We'll send you an invitation. You can come on. We can see your handsome face on the screen lecturing us about these offerings.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You think anyone will take us up on it?
Well, I hope so. You want me to stop sharing this now? Are you done with this?
That's probably enough, for at least they saw what it looked like, some of the wording on it, and they can maybe request a copy of it from you.
Okay.
And maybe by then you can find out where you got it from, because there might be other helpful charts.
Mm-hmm.
It's always, visual is
yes
helpful.
Yeah.
We're visual people.
Mm-hmm.
But as we get further into Leviticus, and we're not going to maybe spend 3 or 4 sessions at the most in the whole book, the one important part besides the offerings and the priests and the other laws is the more detailed description of the holy feast days.
Mm-hmm.
So those become quite important and offer lessons for us ongoing today that's good to look at. So we may have an entire lesson on the holy feast days, and I'm sure you have some documents to share or lessons you've taught or PowerPoint or something that maybe you can share with us on the holy feast days. The holy feast days that in modern English is somewhat misnamed because some of them involve fasting instead of feasting.
Yes. I know Brother Braden Barnum has done a series on the feasts. So
I have too. I have some material on it.
Yes.
So
yeah.
but it might be good to bring him on here. Have him share with us.
Brother Braden, if you're out there, get ready. We may be calling on you.
And we may think up some really hard questions. That'll scare him off.
That will scare him off, yes.
Anyway, thanks, Mike. Thanks to all of you. And please continue to pray for us in this effort. We're just two good friends going through the Bible, talking about Christ, talking about different things we've studied. And we hope that some of it spurs your thinking and is a blessing to you, and that you can use in your own lessons and sermons in your home church. May God bless all of you.
Amen. Amen. Thanks for viewing, guys.